is welcome everybody. We've got a big community here today, lots of folks from all over the world. So I'm excited to be painting this scene. And I thought I'd give you a little bit of background on it first. First of all, if you ever visit the watermill for a painting holiday for a week with one of their tutors, one of the places that you get to go as a painter is way up high on a mountaintop that's in the Appian Alps, and it kind of is right in the line of the ridge of the Apennine mountain ridge that runs the full length of Italy, and really rugged, jagged peaks that stick up.
Hmm.
But where we go at this old medieval village, they have an old church, and it's overlooking these really, really deep valleys. And a lot of times the fog and the clouds are down below us. We're looking out, we're above the clouds. So it's a very striking location, and it's a beautiful little village, and we have a wonderful lunch there. But one of the things that's very difficult when you take a picture is capturing the whole feeling of the place. So whenever I work with photographs to do a painting, I never try to work from one photograph. I'll usually work at minimum with three photos. Sometimes if I can get more, so much the better. In this case, in order to get the mountains and see this ridge of the Apennine mountain ridge that's kind of in the backdrop behind this old church, I needed to superimpose it with some of my photographs and do a photo array so that you really get a sense of what you're looking at. And so what I've done is I've taken these photos and then created my own line drawing where I'm just going to expose some of the peaks coming up through the clouds, and then we'll have a lot of fog and mist and clouds kind of behind the church, which makes the church kind of a backlit so that it's fairly dark. And as we go down to, let's see what I've got here. Hold on. I did a thumbnail that I think most of you got in the Eventbrite registration page that shows how I want to create an impression of this church that's fairly silhouetted against this really light, bright, sunlit, the clouds from the sun shining down on top of the clouds, exposing some of the peaks in the distance. And as you go, I'm going to turn this off and show you this is the painting that we're going to do together. And what in order to do some of this sky, which is really kind of key to making this work, you've got to have some fairly soft blending of clouds with bits of the blue sky peeking through. And one of the ways that I found that can do this very successfully is using some very soft goat hair brushes to kind of very gently kind of soften some of the marks so that we don't have any hard edges. And I use these brushes if you have any kind of a soft brush, much like a makeup brush for some of the ladies, if you're applying makeup, you know what I'm talking about. And that's what this is. It's really soft, and it also I will use this to apply the blue in the sky, very, very wet, so that it's just a lot of water kind of moving around with a little bit of the blue sinking down into the puddles of the sky. And I've with this new camera setup that I've got, I'm allowed or I'm able to superimpose the palette to the side of this image so that you can see me mixing my paint, and you got a little thumbnail of my face there. So I'm assuming that everything's blown up there so you can see it on the screen fairly well. The brushes that I'm going to use, bring it over here so you can see. I've got an Escoda Ultima mop brush. It's a number 16, but it's got a really nice sharp point on it, but it's got a very fat belly that holds a lot of water. Then I have an Escoda Perla brush, which is just a medium-sized round, and that's great for softening edges, blending. It gives me a little point to do some point work, but it's just kind of a utility brush. Great brush. And then for finish work, I've got a little, what do you call it, a rigger. I keep dipping it in water to keep that point nice and sharp. But basically, these three brushes and the two blending brushes are all we're going to use today. So it keeps it very simple. Then as we go back to the line drawing, you can see here I have the actual line drawing and the paper that I'm going to paint on. And I'm going to use manganese blue because if you go back to the actual painting, I think you can see how nicely it granulates. I hopefully you can see that on the paper. I used a little bit of ultramarine in here. They're both sedimentary colors, both prone to doing really extreme granulation. So I'm going to take my the smaller, soft goat hair brush, get it really nice and wet, and I'm just going to pick up a little bit of manganese that I have a big squirt of it here in my palette, and I'm going to mix up some nice, rich manganese with a lot of water so that I've got plenty to work with as I start laying in my sky. And I want to bring, as you look at this, I'm going to just kind of start working in very loose with kind of a jagged edge right up to the edge of my tower of the church that I've drawn out. And I'm going to come in and pick it up again on the other side and then go back and get a little bit more paint and get right down into some of these lower areas here where we got stronger saturation of paint, get more water on my brush, and just come back in and add water to the top of this so that it just thins it out very delicately. And I'm going to leave some white in here just to put these little puddles of water and add water to the tops of these puddles. We want the darkest, hardest edge at the bottom of these areas of blue where they're right up against the white of the cloud. We want the white cloud to be the brightest white of the paper with a fairly hard edge to simulate the sun shining down on the tops of these clouds. As the blue fades back upwards, we're going to soften those with this soft brush and allow it to just fade away. I'm going to pick up just a touch of ultramarine. I did too much, obviously, because I just squirted some ultramarine in my palette. But I'm going to drop a little bit of this ultramarine into that manganese puddle, and the combination of the manganese and the ultramarine will give a really nice, warm but rich little bit of a nice blue right up against those clouds. Then I'm going to rinse my soft goat hair brush, so it's just water on there, and just pick up very barely any paint at all. And I'm going to come over here and just create another little area that might have a little bit darker edge, rinse my brush, and just kind of push this around and not worry about anything. But I want to just kind of suggest a little bit of blue over here in the rest of the sky where it's kind of peeking through some of the heavy clouds that are building up over these mountains. And at the top of each one of these darker deposits of blue pigment, I'm just softening those edges with a little bit of water so that as things run downhill on my board, they start to collect as a hard edge right at the tops of these clouds that are billowing up and rolling over the tops of the ridge of the Apennine Mountains. So there's the sky, and that's about all I'm going to do with that at the moment. I may come back in after this starts to dry and just delicately soften a few little barely uh, deposits of ultramarine in a couple places, soften an edge here or there, and let it kind of pull into the cloud so that it's not a continuous hard edge everywhere. And I'm going to just kind of move around some of the ultramarine that's mixed in with that manganese. The manganese is a very warm blue. The ultramarine is a warm, but it's got a lot more blue and red in it. So it doesn't have quite as a greenish cast as the other um, sky does. We're going to be using a lot of ultramarine mixed with burnt sienna to get our grays and get our darker tones, but this will provide a really nice warmth in the sky that I think will be pretty attractive as a comparison to the other colors that we use in our palette here for the rest of the mountains. So I'm going to let you play with this a minute and just kind of have fun with it. Work it in right around the edge of this tower. I try not to paint over the tower because we're going to handle that after the sky dries. So I'll let you do that. If anybody has any questions, you're unsure about anything, just put it in the chat and Lydia or Lois will relay the question to me. And I don't know if picks up because this is pretty subtle. I'm just barely trying to kind of create little variations in value in some of these things that are just a half step darker in value than the white of the paper in the parts of the sky and the clouds. Eventually, we're going to do a really soft, kind of cloudy mist down around the building later, but that's not right away. We're just working on this upper part of the sky that brackets either side of the tower of the church. So some of the explanations a little more obvious, a little more helpful, and hopefully it'll be a nice addition to what we're doing. All right, I'm going to check this. This is actually still kind of wet. So I'm going to accelerate the drying a little bit so I can come back in and lay in just a little bit more ultramarine, very, very watered down. But if I keep adding the ultramarine wet over wet manganese, I'm going to lose the effect of the manganese. So I'm just going to pick up just a little bit of the ultramarine and drop it down into some of the little crevices towards the bottom of where it's the darkest, and it will give me a really nice kind of gentle, um, a nicer blue. All right, I'm going to also just get a very watered down ultramarine and bring a little bit of this kind of right in above some of the peaks, just like that, just to kind of reinforce that that's kind of the gray of the clouds. That blue could be interpreted as part of the gray of the clouds. If you want, you could just get just a touch of burnt sienna and add that to your ultramarine, and you'll get a gray. And I might just throw some of that, just a wet puddle of that in some of these damp areas, just to kind of give us a little variation. But I don't want to overdo that because then it overpowers the sky. So we'll just soften some of these. And the nice thing about this brush, because it's so soft, you can take your fingers and
Mm.
squeeze out the water out of it and use it to just gently kind of move things around within a wet deposit of paint. And it just softens everything. Gives it a really nice, soft effect that we're after with some of the clouds and the holes in the clouds where bits of sky are peeking through. Okay, I think that's good enough. We don't really need to do a whole lot more. Uh,
Randy,
yeah,
what would the nearest equivalent be to manganese, please?
probably cerulean. And if you wanted to add a little bit of horizon blue, or the equivalent of horizon blue is cobalt teal light, which is a Winsor Newton color. It's basically the same color. And that gives you that kind of green, very pale turquoisey green effect there. All right. What do you say? Are we ready to jump into the next area? I think we probably are. I'm going to soften this line up here where it started to dry. And I want to bring in just a touch more blue up in here over the top of this tower. Okay, there we go. That gives us just enough of a tone as a backdrop for what we're going to do with our center of interest there. We'll let that dry. I'm going to switch over now, I think, to my mop brush. You can see that it's kind of a medium size, number 16, a Skoda. I don't know what the equivalent is to some of these other brushes, but it's a medium size mop. And I'm going to work on the entire vertical plane of the church itself. And the when you look at photographs of this church, it's all stone, and the temptation is to use a lot of brown. I think what we really need to do is start off with ultramarine or cobalt. I'm going to start with cobalt blue and get a nice rich mixture here in my palette of cobalt blue. And I'm also going to mix up a little bit of burnt sienna over here on the side that I can dip my brush in and bring just little bits of it into my cobalt as needed. But for the most part, I'm going to get a nice rich puddle mixed up. So I have plenty of it, of my cobalt blue, and you can see about the value. It's pretty dark. And I'm gonna, and I, now I've completely filled my mop brush with this mixture. So I have plenty, and it won't run out. And the nice thing about this mop is it has a great point on it. I can use that to kind of work right up along the edge. And I'm not going to stop at the corner. I'm just going to work right on through, but make sure you preserve the rooftops as negative shapes. We don't want to paint in those negative shapes because we're going to add some beautiful orange tiled roofs in there. But I'm working as quickly as I can, just
Randy,
moving this paint around the
another
sur-
question for you, please.
say again?
Is it burnt sienna or quince? I can't pronounce it.
No,
Quincerin.
burnt sienna is a sedimentary color, and we're working all sedimentary colors here. The quinacridone burnt orange is, I'm not even using that in this painting because it's so staining. It's going to overpower everything that we're doing. I'm painting right over the doors. I'm painting right over the windows. Don't worry about those. But I'm not going to take it all the way down to the bottom. I'm just going to create sort of a jagged edge here for these bushes or this hedge that's along the bottom of the side of the building. But as I bring this blue up under the eave of the church, I'm just very quickly moving my brush across here and filling this all in. I'll let that dry. I'm going to add just a touch of burnt sienna now while it's wet and just drop it in a few places. And I just barely touched my brush in that burnt sienna that I had pre-mixed, but you could see it warms up that surface immediately. And even though it will dry as kind of a neutral gray, when it dries, it still gives it a little bit of warmth. Now, on the other side over here, we've got light hitting that at a little bit different direction. So it's going to be warmer. Now I'm going to use more of my burnt sienna mixture and a little bit of the ultramarine mixture. And I'm going to come back in underneath this rooftop and create, a little bit of jagged edge right underneath those tiles. Bring it down. And the nice thing about a mop brush is it just is loaded with pigment and water, so it just doesn't run out of pigment. It just keeps going and keeps going. And while it's all wet, I'm going to pick up more of this cobalt blue. And as we get down towards this bush that's in the foreground, I'm just going to gradually allow this puddle to get darker with a darker value. And then there's a little shadow across the entryway here. I'm just going to connect it to the rest of the side over on this side. So now I'm going to pick up just a little bit of orange and I'm going to come underneath this and I'll go back and add just a little bit more ultramarine as we get down in this little corner here. And I can take my blending brush, squeeze all the water out of it, and I can use this to kind of move my paint around and soften everything. And I do think I need a little bit more cobalt, so I'm just going to add a little bit more with this big brush while it's wet and the water's sitting on the surface of the paper. And that did a nice job. Okay, we'll let that alone for the moment, and I'll let you finish this up. One of the things that I did is I have a shadow that goes across the top of this little entry patio at the top of the steps, but I'm leaving the steps uh, white for the moment. And we're just going to let all this pigment start settling down into the tooth of the paper. I'm going to add just a little bit more burnt sienna to my ultramarine and add just a little bit more dark right in this little area here, maybe right down in here, so that it gets darker as it comes up against this tree that's growing along the edge of the building. But you can see having that little bit of ultramarine it makes this whole end of the building just a little bit darker. And that helps kind of play up this hedge. While we've got a nice wet wall there, I'm going to pick up a little bit of what color did we say we were using for greens? The greens we're going to use um, leaf green or turquoise or lemon yellow. So we can take ultramarine and a little bit of lemon yellow, just mix up just a small amount of this green. And I'm going to come back in and I'm going to leave a white separation between the top of the bushes and the underside of the bushes so that I don't bleed too much up into the side of the building. I'm going to get just a little bit darker, add a little bit more ultramarine. And as we get on the underside of this bush here, you can see there's still a little bit of yellow mixed in with that ultramarine. It makes a nice, rich green hedge. I'm using my Escoda brush now, and I'm just gonna kind of drag that edge across some of the white areas, just so that there's just a few little spots of white along the top of that hedge. But everything starts to get a little cooler with my ultramarine and a little bit of the lemon yellow. And we start working our way towards the right end of the building. Okay, now I'm going to take a little bit of burnt sienna and ultramarine, and that makes a really nice dark. And guess what? That's the undercutting beneath this hedge where it's a bit in shadow. So I'm just allowing a little bit of the darks to kind of poke through in a few places. We've got a stair here. I'm just going to throw a little dark in that shadow there that's coming down the stairs. Maybe bring a couple verticals in there. There we go. But clean my brush, get all the pigment off of it, wipe it off, and then just kind of blend and soften this right into the side of the building there. If you get a little bloom or anything, just take your soft brush, squeeze all the water out of it. Sometimes if you just take a Kleenex and squeeze the water out so it's fairly dry, you can come back in and just soften things so that they don't have any problems at all. I think what I'm going to do is take the tip of my little perla round and drop a few little droplets of water along this edge just to soften the top of this hedge where it'll bloom. And it'll soften and it'll get some striations in there. It'll just do some kind of strange little things that you can't quite anticipate. You don't know exactly what it's going to do, but I guarantee it's going to feel very organic. So I'm going to add a little more green in a couple of these places. My green is pretty neutral. It's not a real bright green. You see what's happening? That water is running up into the side of the building. Don't worry about that. We're going to come back and put some stonework and things on this later. I had a bit of the pigment dry across the edge of this radius here, so I'm just going to soften that. When I mixed, I'll keep talking while you're painting, but when I mixed my ultramarine and my burnt sienna to put the undercutting underneath this little hedge and create this shadow, you see how it made a really nice dark. You can make that into a very pale gray, or you can make it into a very dark gray, depending on how much pigment versus water you use. In this case, I've used a lot of pigment. The ultramarine and the burnt sienna, they cancel each other out and they make a dark gray. But it really anchors that building along that shadow. The sun is above and a little behind this building, which is why it creates this backlighting effect. But it's going to be casting a bit of a shadow on the yard here in front of the church. So we want to get a little bit of dark in there. Now, the nice thing about watercolor, it's all about timing. It's very spontaneous. The longer you take to do something, or the slower you go at it, the less um, spontaneity you get. So I think you need to embrace any mistakes and embrace any blooms. Make that part of your painting. Just include it and enjoy that is something that makes it special. All right, I think what we're going to do next, after you get this done, is we'll work on our mountain peaks because they're going to be very similar mixture of paint. We're going to work primarily with cobalt, touch of burnt sienna, no, not as much ultramarine. The ultramarine will make it feel closer to us and warmer. We want a cooler blue for those mountain peaks, which is why we're going to use the cobalt as our base
Randy, can
for
you
the.
remind everyone what the dark greens were, please?
Say it again.
Can you remind everyone what the dark greens were, please?
The dark green,
Mm-hmm.
I use lemon yellow and ultramarine. And the
So
more
it's a mix
ultramarine
rather
you
than
use and
a,
the less yellow, the darker green it
yeah.
gets.
So it's a mix rather than
You
a
want to get this
color.
dark shadow in here, you add a little touch of burnt sienna to the ultramarine. That makes sense? And it probably doesn't. It seems counterintuitive that burnt sienna would turn black like that. But here in my palette is ultramarine. And if I add a little bit of burnt sienna to it, look how dark it gets. It's a really dark gray. It's almost like a Payne's gray, but it's all sedimentary color. So it's going to be easy to lift. It's because it doesn't stain the paper. If you sprinkle a little water on it, you're going to get nice blooming. And that's the beauty of working with the sedimentary colors. So in this case, I'm going to rinse that off my brush and I'm going to take just a damp brush and just drop a little bit into this damp area and see what happens. It doesn't look like anything's happening right now. It's just a couple of little speckles of water. But because that's still damp, in a few minutes, that will start giving me a little, it'll start repelling the paper or repelling the paint on the paper and make little dewdrops in there that suggest sparkles of light on the hedges. But the next thing we're going to work on is up here, these mountain peaks. Hopefully you've got a few little peaks sketched in from our photo reference. And I'm going to use the Perla round brush, so I have a lot of control over it. I don't need a lot of paint. When you use the mop brush, that's the tool you use when you want to have a lot of paint that'll go forever. In this case, we're barely going to put any tint on these mountain peaks. So I want control. So I'm going to use a round. And a Perla round by Escoda is a great workhorse. And I think most of the tutors I've worked with this past year all use Perla brushes in their toolkit. Okay, we're going to mix up a little bit of cobalt. That's pretty bright. I'll take just a dab of this stuff mixed up over here that's got some burnt sienna and ultramarine in it. But mainly, I'm going to take a little bit of water now and take one edge of that puddle and dilute that a little bit more. I'll come back in now, and right at the peak, I want to drop in some nice blue. And I don't go all the way because the top of the backside of that mountain's getting sunlight. So I'm just going to paint a little dark on this shadow side of the peak that's coming down. Now I'm going to rinse my brush. I don't have any paint on it. I'm just going to push a damp brush up towards the top of that puddle of water. And where I've dampened the paper, it'll start pulling that pigment downward. I'm going to go back and get a little bit more saturated paint and do this next peak and make it fairly dark. Clean my brush and then just push a little bit of damp brush towards that dark deposit of paint. I'll come back on the other side and I want to make sure that across my ridge, the tops of these peaks all have a little bit darker value. And I'm dropping a little bit darker into some of these. Clean my brush, and then dilute that little puddle off to the edges so that it just kind of fades away. We sort of start losing some of the edge work and we just start pulling it down because everything goes downhill, down the slope. So we want to just create that impression that it's continuing on down. Now I'm going to rinse my brush and really just soften this and make it disappear into the white of the paper. And guess what? Where I've wet my paper It looks like the paper's white and it looks like I have just feathered away the dark altogether. But guess what? It's going to, where this is damp along the bottom edge of these peaks, it's going to continue pulling this dark pigment all the way down until it reaches the edge of where I dampened the paper. So you almost have to always take a little tissue and come in and just blot up that damp area where the paper is white to prevent that hydraulic action of pulling the pigment downward. And you can always come back and you can add, little bits of darker bit paint to create, darker areas within this. I'm going to come in and add some of the darker pigments in a few spots. Way over here, I might have another bit of peak that's just kind of barely visible, but it disappears into the cloud. And then once that dries, I'll come back in and add some more stuff on the backside of some of these peaks. But I wanted to get my base color down into where these peaks are. And if you drag the side of your brush, you'll get sort of a dry brush effect in a few places where it'll kind of skip over the tooth of the paper if you're on cold press. But don't bring it to a hard edge here. You want it to just kind of disappear. So now I'm going to take this other feathering brush that's just totally dry, and I'm just going to kind of soften and pull that pigment down into the white of the paper. So it just pretty much disappears. You see how that just softened that? Now we'll come back later after that dries and I'll add a few more marks of very light blue to give it some texture and some depth in some of the ravines. But we've got our basic mountain peaks defined. We'll come back to that later. We're going to do the tower next. And I want that to be a little lighter in value than these two vertical surfaces because they go up a little higher in the sky. So all we have to do is just add a little bit more water. And I'm going to add just a little more cobalt blue to keep it on the cool side. But I'm going to use my mop brush and I'm not going to worry about the cornices. I'm not going to worry about the windows. I'm not going to worry about any of the architectural details. I'm just going to come back in and very carefully fill this whole thing in with a light finish of a wash and just pull it down. And then I'm going to rinse my brush so I hardly have any pigment in it at all. And I'll just pull this pigment over onto this side, which is getting more light. Remember, this side's lighter than that. This side of it over here on the right is also a little lighter. But as we come down, I just want to make sure that it just stays nice and just a couple steps darker in value than the white of the paper. And then I'll pull a little bit more of ultramarine into my mixture. I'll mix it up with a little bit of everything. And I'll just kind of fill in, add a little bit of burnt sienna. And I'm going to drop this right in to this little alcove that's set back behind the wall. Clean my brush, and I'm just going to drag this up the side of the building to make sure it's all blended in. But it's darkest down here at the bottom where it's in shadow. And I'm going to get a little of that burnt sienna out of there. So I'll just drop in some more of this ultramarine that's in my palette and just let that roll around. And I could take this all the way up kind of into this area here and let it kind of run down and dry like that. Rinse your brush, set your brush aside and let that water do the work for you. You don't touch it anymore. The more you touch the paper, the more you lose the spontaneity. I'm going to take this small brush. It's a small perla, and I'm going to use, the only reason I'm going to use this is to wick up some of this excess water and wipe it off on a tissue, just simply so that it doesn't get too pooled up there at the base. Eventually, we're going to come back in and paint those doors dark. We're going to paint the cornices on there. We'll paint the dark inside the windows. But for now, this is all we're going to do is just leave it like this. So we've got our next step. Once this is all done, once you finish this up, we're going to switch up some colors here and start mixing a little bit different palette. I'm just cleaning up the edge here. There we go. All right, rinse and set aside. I'm going to create a little area in my palette where I can mix up a different color while you're finishing that up. All I'm doing is just kind of doing a little house cleaning here off to the side so that I have a place to mix some orange. We're gonna,
Randy, if not now, but maybe later, would you mind putting in the chat where you got those brushes from?
sure,
Thank
yes,
you.
I will do that. Um, Actually, you know what I'll do? I'll put all of that in the, what do you call it? The
Oh, the
cluster.
cluster. Yeah, perfect.
I'll do that because I have more ability to type things in on that. At
Okay,
any
thank you
rate,
so much.
what we're going to do is we're going to build up our rooftop next. And these rooftops, we're going to start with a really nice transparent orange. My orange is Schminke's transparent orange. And we can also use a little bit of burnt sienna with this as well. But to start off with, we want to keep it strictly the transparent orange. Next step is going to be going into our palette and mixing up this really nice transparent orange. And it's a bright orange. It's not a tangerine or a apricot orange. It's a earthy kind of red rocks orange. Um, and it's a beautiful orange I use from Schminke. And I want to get plenty of pigment on my brush so that, and I'm using my round. I'm not using the mop brush because I've got a fairly narrow area that I want to apply this paint to. So I don't want to get too sloppy with it. I want to have more control. And a round brush will give you more control because it doesn't carry too much water. And I'll start back here at the hip and bring it down. Whoops, kind of bled right into my wet area there. But I'm going to bring it across the top. And I've got a very jagged top. If you've ever been to this place, you know that these tiles are really old. They're a little bit weathered and decayed, and there's some broken tiles. And I just want to kind of come across and give myself the opportunity to just drag this across like that. So I've got that nice bright orange. We're going to dull it down later. I'll pick up some more of this and come over and put a couple of stripes in like this that follow the perspective. And I've got a little bit of a jagged top here where the little hills of the rounded tiles cut into that white. I'm going to leave some white in there intentionally because I want to have a couple of little sparkles of white. We're going to do the same thing down below, but I'm going to use a little bit more burnt sienna. We'll mix some of this orange with the burnt sienna. It's a little darker, it's down kind of a little lower. And again, I'm just going to add a few stripes in here. As I get up against the building, it'll get a little more connected and darker. But as we pull away from the building, I want to leave a few whites in there and I'll come back in and glaze over those later with another color. But this gives me the darker um, part of the tile there. I can also come back in at the bottom edge or the lower edge of some of these orange stripes I put on here and just drop some of this burnt sienna into that wet shape. And it gives it a little darker, warmer look as it gets closer to the viewer. And you see how this is bleeding into the building? Don't worry about that. If you're lucky enough to have that, just don't fix it. Leave it. I'm going to come back with some of that really bright transparent orange, and I'm going to reach across so my hand is not dragging through my painting. And I want to just catch the top edge of some of the tiles here so that I have a nice orange showing against that white sky. Clean my brush, completely get all the water off of it, blot it on a rag or a tissue, and I'm just going to tickle some of these tiles and drag them into the sky a little bit just to kind of allow some of that to be a halo effect that gets up into the sky. I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm going to just tickle some of that orange across the top edge of that. And what it allows some of that orange to bleed up into the white clouds, and it just gives it a softer effect. And we want to have harder edges, more defined in other places. This is not exactly where we want the viewer to be, you know, ending up. So we soften that a little bit, and it gives it a nice effect. I'm going to come back in and pick up some of this. I've got a clean brush, it's barely damp, and I can pick up some of that burnt sienna on this part of the rooftop as it wraps around this radius here. And it just, by doing that, I'm allowing some of the white paper to glow through, and it gives, we're kind of rejuvenating the white of the paper. Not all the way, but it allows it to breathe. Okay, this is still a little wet, so I'm going to let you finish that before we do anything else. While you've got this on your brush, you might want to come back in here and in a couple places, just drop some of the same color from the roof into some of these bushes. You're not going to see it. It's just going to add a little bit of warmth to some of those bushes at the base of the building. And I think you'll find that it just ties things together very nicely. All right. So far, so good, huh? Now, if I'm going to dry this while you're finishing up, and I'm using a heat gun here so it's silent and allows me to keep talking. What I'm going to do is take a little bit of the ultramarine and mix it with the burnt sienna to make a darker color. And that's going to be the underside of these barrel tiles that are on the rooftop. So I'll just take a little of the whatever's here in my palette and mix it with some of that orange. And then I'll just kind of use the tip of my brush and come in a couple of spots and add a little bit of darks along this edge here, maybe a little bit up in the peak of the building. And it really does a nice job of kind of defining the old weathered tiles that are hanging over the edge of the building. Kind of gives a nice little definition. And these are just little puddles of water, but they're very effective. They're useful in what they're doing. All right. I can take that same color because it's still just a little bead of a bubble of paint that's sitting on the surface. And with the point of my brush, I can pull some of these up along the lines that I had drawn in there for my barrel tiles. And I can create the kind of the directionality of how these tiles are laid on the roof. It just gives a,
Randy, could you
yeah.
just say again the colors that you used for the edge?
Anytime you use ultramarine and burnt sienna, you're going to get a dark. And the more water you use, the lighter it'll be. The less water you use, the darker it'll be. So if you, this is right here, there's a puddle in my palette. I don't know if you can see it. It's ultramarine. This over here has got a lot of burnt sienna in it. There you can see it right there. If I mix the ultramarine with the burnt sienna, I can make it warmer or I can make it cooler depending on how much blue or how much burnt sienna I add to the mixture. But regardless, it gets darker and darker. And it becomes a beautiful way to use a sedimentary mixture to create a really nice dark. For instance, shadows,
And then
undercutting of
we're
the
seeing
bushes.
a little bit of feedback that the main image is coming over a little fuzzy, but I wonder if that might be connection rather than anything
I
else.
think it's probably a connection because I'm
Yeah.
looking at my screen. It's pretty crisp, so I'm not sure. All right, I'm going to continue doing what I just did here. I'm going to come back in underneath this part of the roof and just add a little bit of dark with the tip of my brush, not overtly too much, but just enough that I get some darks in there. Clean my brush, wipe all the water off, and using the edge of the brush, just kind of tickle that and let it just kind of run down the side of the building as a soft shadow that darkens the surface of there. Do the same thing over here. We're just creating a little bit of a shadow underneath that. All right, now let's use some of that same color that we were mixing up, and I can come back in and add a little bit of dark in some of these spots coming up to reinforce the directionality on this little bit of rooftop that's on the edge of the building here. I don't know if you can see it in my sketch, but there's a bush or a tree that actually grows right up along the edge of the building. I'm going to bring the painting back in here so you can see it. See this little tree? It kind of it engulfs the wrought iron fence that's along the edge of the cliff. It goes down the side of the mountain, and then the vines are growing up along the side of the church. So that is really how the edge of that church gets terminated, getting lost inside the vegetation of that bush. We have another big bush that's in the middle of this yard that's kind of blocking our view of the entry. The actual location of that bush is right about here, but it would obscure our painting. So I took the artistic liberty of moving it a little bit over to create a shadow and give us a little bit of a dagger of light that comes up through here where the sunlight is coming peeking across the top of the building, and that helps bring us to our center of interest visually. So it's a pathway of light that's very intentional that I put in here, simply by moving this big uh, the big bush that's here. And then even though the sun's up here, I took some liberty and put a shadow across here just to create some warmth and dark here to make this pathway of light um, more suggestive, more dramatic. I have another painting that I did of this the other day, and here you can see it's even more. Uh, the contrast is more dramatic here, I think, just in leading us to the entry to this church. But anyway, those are the kind of the objectives of what we're going for compositionally. So if we're ready to move on, I want to go back to my rooftop and use some of this in my palette that's really kind of a darker burnt sienna-ish. And I want to put some undercutting and some shadows under along in a few spots where there's broken tiles. And it just helps define the upper edge of the building of the rooftop. And I think it just kind of is a nice way to separate it from the mist and the stuff behind. Don't get too much paint on there. I just wicked up that big blob of paint that came off the edge of my brush. Um, Sometimes that happens and you just have to react. But that just gives a defining edge to it. Now, let's what are we going to do next here? Let's go back to our mountain peaks while we've got all this stuff still mixed up in our palette. And this is pretty uh, pale. I want to come back in and just reinforce a little bit some more crevicing and some things that might be a little more obvious. I'm going to clean my brush and soften those marks, blend them in, leaving in a few places. But you can see I'm just softening things and allowing some of these marks to come down and create almost a dry brush effect in a few spots. And then I just take a damp brush and I soften this. And I think that helps. Now, the back side of that, I'm going to take a little bit of this lighter manganese puddle of water. It's not really even paint, it's just kind of a puddle. And it's going to tint the back side of that mountain just a little bit, like there might be snow or something back there, but it's a little lighter than the foreground edge of the ridge. And I want to get that ridge line kind of defined. That's too repetitive. See how there's a repetitive? So when you see that happening, just kill it. When I say kill it, I mean just blend it away or change it, do anything you need to do so that you don't see a lot of repetition. I'm going to take my blending brush and see if I can't just soften the bottom of that down into the clouds. And basically what I'm doing is I'm grabbing a little of this pigment that I've put on the mountain and I'm pulling it into the white of the paper just to give it a really nice soft transition. And it works pretty well. There you go. Might be too much, so I'll just pick some of it up. See, you can do that, take a tissue and just kind of blot it, and it gives it a nice change. All right. So now let's work on our let's put our a little bit of warmth to the foreground. I'm going to take my big brush, this big blending brush, get a little bit of yellow, lemon yellow on it, and I just want to kind of come in like this and just add a little bit of tone in here. And then as we get down closer, I'm going to add just a little bit of blue to that so that it takes on a little bit more of a green hue, a little cobalt and that yellow. And we'll just kind of allow this to slowly get warmer as it comes towards us, a little bit darker. But I'm leaving this the lightest right in here. And we'll build up these darks in this shadow area after this dries. But I'm also going to use that same mixture that I just mixed up, a little bit of kind of a very light wash of blue and yellow. And I'm just going to put some of this, I'm not going to go all the way out to the edge of the bush. I'm just going to come in about a quarter of the way and bring in some warmth in a few spots there. I'll pick up some of the mixture of the grays and when I say grays, it's the ultramarine and the burnt sienna mixture that's already in my palette. And I'm just going to drop little bits and pieces of it into this wet puddle of a bush, just so that the whole thing starts to get a little more of a shadowy dark on the backside here. It's kind of subtle. Might even take a little bit of the orange, drop a little of that in there. Go back and get a little bit more of the blue as I get down here in the bottom. Add a little bit of the whatever I can find here that might be sedimentary. And then I'll take my medium round and I'll just drop some water in there and see what happens. It'll start blooming and it'll push some of that pigment around because it's sedimentary. It's not staining the paper. It's sitting up on the surface of the paper. And it will just start styrating. My board is slightly at an angle, so gravity will pull some of that downward. And if I want, I can maybe take a little bit more of the yellow and the cobalt, make a little bit more cobalt and add, just a little bit more of the green in that wash and just continue pulling it right into my shadow. I'm going to take ultramarine and burnt sienna and I will create a nice soft shadow. And I'll add a little bit more burnt sienna and a little bit more ultramarine. Ooh, that's too much. Keep forgetting I've got fresh ultramarine there and it gets pretty nasty. But I'm going to just drop this in a few spots. And this is really working wet and wet because my paper's already damp from that initial thing in there when I put the green in the yard. And I'll come back and I'll get more of the green and the blue and the burnt sienna. And I'm going to drop that in right at the base of this bush so it gets a little darker. And I don't have to really be too careful. It's just throwing it in there while it's damp. And it creates this nice, soft, shadowy area on the backside of this bush. And we'll come back in and put some marks and things in there later after after it all dries. So I'm going to put a little bit of the yellow. We'll get I'm going to get a little bit more ultramarine of my burnt sienna in here to get a nice dark underneath this bush. You got to do this while the paper's just still slightly damp. And I'll take my spray bottle and I'll just kind of soften this a little bit in that corner. And now the water, the pigment is just kind of running across the surface of the paper and getting very soft. So I'll let you do that, kind of play with it, have fun with it. This, see how spontaneous and what kind of reactions you can get when the water touches this wet and wet wash of kind of dark neutrals. I call them dark neutrals because burnt sienna and ultramarine make a beautiful dark neutral. But see how this is starting to run a little bit? It's going to feel like part of the bush when we're done. And I can accelerate the run a little bit if I wick up along the tape. That'll continue pulling some of that moisture down. So we'll see how that works. There we go. I like that. That's kind of fun. But see how I left the paper white up here on the outer edge of this bush? We'll come back and add a few little dry marks on there later to suggest that there's leaves and little shadow holes going through this. But we had to get this soft, wet and wet bush here in the foreground. That's not our center of interest. It's a device that I'm using to hold the corner and keep our vision and keep our attention focused on the church and not running off the page. So that's strictly part of the kind of the thought process of going into this. And I'm going to darken while this is still wet out on the edge of this shadow a little bit. There we go. That paper, you can see the paper is still very, very wet. But I like what it's doing. I think it's important to just give it a chance to kind of settle and do its thing without picking at it. And I think our biggest temptation is always to want to go back in and keep picking at a painting and playing around with it. But now we can do a very similar thing with the same brushes and a lot of the same pigment for this little tree that's over here on the right end of the church. We're going to take a little bit of the yellow and get it nice and again, you don't necessarily need to go all the way out to the edge of the tree line where you've sketched in your pencil or pencil line where you've sketched in your bush. But I do want to get a little bit of the cobalt blue mixed with that yellow, the lemon yellow, to get sort of a green. And I'll come back in and add a little bit of the green in a few places. And I've got enough moisture on my brush here that I don't need to make this a wet and wet. Just the moisture itself will take care of that. And then I'm going to come out here on the edge and get a little darker right up on the top of these caps of these pillars just to help define those pillars, making them into a negative shape. Now we're getting down into the shadows here. I'm going to go back and mix up. Remember how I mixed this color up? It was ultramarine and burnt sienna. I'm going to take some of that same pigment that's in my palette, already pre-mixed, and just create some darks. And I'm going to come back on the other side of this little pillar to create some of the little up flares of the bush. And then I'll take my small round, any small brush is good, but just sprinkle a little bit of water droplets in that and let them kind of make dewdrops, repelling the pigment. These are all sedimentary colors reviews, so I should have no problem making little mini blooms that we're going to put in there to suggest what the tree looks like. And then we can always take a few darks in a couple places and create some little, I don't know what you call them, things that are kind of sticking out against that cloud. All right. I want to let that dry. We can always drop a little bit of water into our shadow if you want to get that to break up a little bit. It's kind of fun. I am going to add just a touch of warmth now, some burnt sienna to my shadow on this big bush here in the foreground. I want to get just a little bit more warmth in there. Warm comes forward, cool pushes away. So if this shadow has a little bit of warmth in it, it's going to feel closer to us than a cooler shadow that's got more cobalt in it. But you can see this whole thing's already coming together pretty fast. First thing we got to do is dry this shadow so we don't drag our hand through it while it's wet. So I'm going to let you finish painting. I'm going to sit here and use my heat gun to see if I can get this pigment to settle down and lose the shine on it so it starts to settle into the paper. It's still wet, but it's not not so wet that if I touch it, it's going to pick up the paint. One of the things I'd like to do is take just a nice wash of whatever, barely there neutral I've got. It's and just drag it across some of these white shapes that are on this rooftop because this is down in shadow, and I want to just make them not quite as brilliant as they might appear in some other places. And we'll just get some darks in here a little bit. And I want to get some really nice darks on the back side of this tree as it comes down into the shadows. And then the posts, these are stone columns that have wrought iron connected and keep people from falling off. This is literally a sheer drop off off this yard here. And that's how this church is built on the edge of a very steep mountainside to give you these views. But what we want to do is create a shadow side. And I'm just going to come in with a dark and just drag this down so that I've got the back side of each one of these little stone pillars in shadow. And it just uses the mixture of ultramarine and burnt sienna to give us a nice little mix. And I'm going to get this one a little cooler, a little darker as it gets closer to us. It's too blue. So we'll add more burnt sienna to it, a little more burnt sienna, I mean ultramarine in some of these. Clean my brush and just allow the water to kind of come downhill. And then when we get down to the base, I want to have this just kind of come back, just kind of a very loose little shadowy area where they create a run out of shadow. Clean my brush, and then just drag that puddle of water out into the yard so it gets softer and lighter as it moves away from the pillar. And then I'm going to use a little bit of the green that I had mixed up for the bushes there and drag that right up along the underside of this what do you call it? The wrought iron. And you can see it really doesn't have a lot of color. It just has a base tint of some green that was in our mixture, but it's pretty neutral. But it helps to really define the edge of that cliff and get under. And then I'll put a little shadow on the back side of the caps when everything dries. But we want to come back in now with a little bit of cooler green. And I'm using this little apple green. It's just a quick shortcut to soften it. And I'm going to come in underneath this shadow and just soften this a little bit so it's not quite as hard an edge of dark. And I'll just give us a softer transition into the greens in there. And I think that does a nice job of it there, like that. And then we can use these big brushes to come in on this side with a little bit more of the yellow and the cobalt to create kind of and I'm going to just rinse this and just soften that entirely. So it just kind of isn't too white down here in the lower right corner. I don't want to have us pull this off the page. We'll leave our lightest light right up and underneath there. Okay. So have fun with that. I'm going to just soften this edge, blend that green into my shadow now that my shadow is dry. and we'll give you a little time to catch up with the shadows on the pillars, a little bit of softening of that edge, shadow edge underneath the hedge that's at the base of the building, and then just transitioning some warmer green right down between the edge of the shadow and that little dagger of light that's going across our painting diagonally. I see that this is starting to dry and leave a pretty defined edge. So what I'm going to do when you start to see that happen is I take this brush and I squeeze all the water out of it. You can even take a tissue to get all the moisture out of it. And then I'll just go like this and just soften that into the yard. So it just is a very organic feel to the yard. Didn't have any hard edges. It's pretty soft. And I can do that up in here too. Keeps it nice and soft. All right, time to dry. We don't drag our hand through everything because we're going to work up in the upper left part of the painting next. I'm going to move away from this part, go to a different place in the painting, and it's important to give all this other stuff a chance to kind of dry. You notice that this was mostly water in here. It looked pretty dark when it went down, but it's drying very pale and light. We're going to add a little bit of warmth to the side of those pillars later. But for now, I want to take some burnt sienna and mix it with just a little bit of the blue that we've got, and we'll create kind of a nice warm cornice color. And the reason I wanted everything dry is you're almost going to have to put the palm of your hand in the middle of your painting. And using the tip or the sharp point of this brush, we will come back in and create the nice cornice at the top. And if it needs to have a little bit more water, a little bit more blue and to the burnt sienna, you can adjust the amount of water to paint ratio on your brush. But I'm just going to very carefully just create this little overhang cornice, and then it wraps around the back side of the buildings. So it gets a little dark, and we start to see the shape that defines the building. Then I'm going to clean my brush, get all the pigment off of it, wipe it off, take it on a tissue and wipe it down. And I'm just going to soften the bottom edge of that cornice into the side of the building so that you just really don't see where the cornice ends. It just kind of becomes a bit of a shadow there. And we'll just let that be. All right, we're going to do the same thing with this cornice down here. This is just sort of a little architectural feature, and this is where the tip of your brush comes in really handy. You can get those little features that stick out a little bit. And then I would go to more of a burnt sienna, warmer color, and create just the overhang or the indentation of this little frieze thing that's on the side of the building, just to suggest that's there. Now we've got the bell tower. I'm going to use almost all my whatever I have here in my mixing well of ultramarine and add it to the burnt sienna to create a really nice dark. But I'm going to go a little drier with the blue. And I'm going to leave the edge of the building, the fatness of the building white, and I'll come back in and glaze over that. I'm going to also leave a little sliver of light where the bell tower is exposed on the other side as you look through this bell tower. I'm going to clean my brush, get all the paint off of it, and I'm going to go back in and pick up some of that excess blue down at the bottom and add just a little bit more of the burnt sienna, um, so that there's some warmth in there in that blue. And it's the coolest, darkest at the top and a little bit warmer at the bottom. And then I'll take a tissue and I'll just kind of dab some of that paint about in the middle so that it feels like there's some light and glow coming through there. I'm going to go back to my original dark pigment color using the same brush and just make a slash on this side for my other, what do you call it, bell tower window. You don't see the full width of it. You're seeing it obliquely at an angle. Once that dries, I'm going to glaze over the thickness of the walls so that you actually feel that there's some undercutting there. We also have a little bit of warmth where there's a slight indentation in the feature architecturally, and we can just kind of put those little details on. They're not that critical. Um, but while that's drying, we want to mix up some green. I'm going to use this apple green and mix it with my ultramarine and my burnt sienna to create a really nice dark. I'm trying to get as much dark as I can. I'm going to add a little bit of green to this, and I want to leave a sliver of white on either side of the tower, but just so it's like we're seeing around the edge of the tower. But then here's these trees that are behind it. I'm going to clean my brush a little bit and get it more of a dry brush. Use the paint that's already on the paper to give me the enough paint. And I'm just going to dry brush this by using the heel or the side of my brush to create these wispy tree boughs that are sticking out. There's one side, and then we'll do the other side. Got a pine tree over here, and this is pretty dry. I'm not doing a real wet on wet. I'm trying to just, get some of the dry brush effects in here. And then once I have a little sliver of white around, like a halo around this building tower, I'll come back in with my blue and I'll drop in some darker pigment in a couple of places there. Now it looks like trees that are right behind the building, which there's a whole grove of trees behind this building. And this is how you kind of bracket the tower and give it a nice impression. So go ahead and do that. And when you're done with that, we'll go on to the next step. And notice how I left a little bit of that bright orange on the tops of the tile. That would be the sunlight, hitting the tops of those rooftop tiles. And then the dark underneath it is warmer than the trees behind. That's the shadow or the undercutting beneath the barrel tiles. And you notice I don't have a lot of texture within those trees. It's just kind of a flat, dark color that is in the background. If you give too much,
Randy, um,
yes,
could you just say what? There's a few color questions. So I think it's mostly for the trees behind the bell tower.
I used ultramarine and burnt sienna and a little bit of my apple green that I had that I
And
told people.
who makes the apple green that you have?
Well, I don't know. There's all different manufacturers have different colors. It's just like an apple green. It comes out of the tube. I put it in my palette that way, and it was right here. It's all got ultramarine in it, but you can see it's got some nice light green. You mix that with the ultramarine, and it gets dark quickly. See? But it keeps a warmer green cast as opposed to a blue cast. And then you add the ultramarine and the burnt sienna to that, and it gets really, really dark. But again, they're all sedimentary colors. All right, while we've got these darks mixed up, and I don't know if you can see my palette, but I've got this big lake full of really dark darks. I can add drier paint to that and make it even darker. I'm going to use the point of my brush, this round brush that's got a nice point to it, and I'm going to come back in and I'm going to put just a little tick mark right here, right here, right here, and right here. And those are the little windows that are built into the stone wall. And back in the medieval days, I'm sure that was, a lookout or, for protection, whatever. I'm not sure if it just let in light, but we've got the same slashes of windows on the front of this building. And I'm just going to kind of put a little slash in here with these. And by going really dark with those against this mid-tone wall, it gives the effect of being very deep and dark and shadowy and tells us there's something going on in there. It has a sense of depth to it, which is nice. And then we've got a little bit of one right on the dormer edge or the gable edge of the building right there. Now, we also have, I think there's three windows along the perpendicular side of this building that come away. We might as well do those at the same time. It's the same mixture. I'm going to move my microphone a little bit, but we're going to just put a little slash. We don't need much. It's just an indication. Clean your brush. I'm going to actually take a tissue and kind of blot that a little bit so it's not quite so obvious. And I might take a little bit of the burnt sienna and keep it warm as opposed to these that are very cool. And that's all you got to do. And now we've taken care of most of our shadowy stuff. I'm gonna just put a little hint of an oval up here where this clock face is. I'm not going to do a full oval circle around it, just a couple on the shadow sides. And that should take care of that. Um, okay. Let me know when you're done with that and we'll do the doors. We've got three doors we're going to do next. And these get a nice a nice batch of burnt sienna. And our buildings are nice and dry. So I'm going to cut in and just take the width of my brush and really put a nice dark in there where this door is. Pick up some of the dark that I had for the windows and add that in that wet shape. Clean my brush and just finish out that door with water so that it just gets lighter on the left side, it's darker on the right side, and it just suggests that there's more depth there than we thought to give it the impression that there's a doorway there. We're going to do similar thing to this arched door beneath it. It's kind of like the monk's back door, I guess. I'm not sure. But we'll add some warmth to that on the bottom where we can actually see the burnt sienna. And then we'll add this ultramarine to it at the top where it's really in shadow. But I don't ever use one color to do a doorway or a window. I try to have some really dark, cool colors and then some warmer uh, colors to give it some variation. Sometimes you can just take a little bit of a tissue and run it across the door just to blot up a little bit of the pigment. For the front door, we're going to take more of the burnt sienna, and I'll just come back in and kind of come across the arch with my tip of my brush. Go back in and get some of the ultramarine. Come down the shadow side on the right. Clean my brush. And then over on the left side with a damp brush, I'll just kind of obliterate the edge of that doorway. So we're not real sure that we're seeing everything. We're just kind of getting the impression that there's stuff there. I might even add some orange to this just to kind of give it some variation. All right, now I talked about going, oh, there's another little very faint architectural detail that comes across here. You don't have to do much, just just a little slash that goes across. I'm going to take my brush and just get some watered down burnt sienna from whatever's in my palette here. It's just sort of the junk neutrals, and I'm going to make sure it's mostly water. And I'm just going to put a little hint of warmth across the sunny side of these pillars, just so that there's some tone on them that would suggest stonework. And we'll let that dry. There we go. All right. I like how that bush came out. We need to tuck the steps behind the bush, so that calls for some darks. So we're going to just get some water on our brush, a little bit of dampness, and we're going to mix up some of those cool neutrals. And I want to start at the corner and move back towards the wall and just put a single slash like this that suggests where those steps are. without getting too detailed. That's too much. And we'll just leave it fairly light. And then once that dries, I'll put the shadow in the opposite direction. I want to get this straightened up. There we go. And maybe we'll have more of a burnt sienna wash, just a very pale wash for the sidewalk down here. And that would pretty much take care of that. I'm going to put some ultramarine in that while it's wet to suggest the edge of the sidewalk, and we'll just let it roll. All right. Getting getting near the rigger work and the mist. We got to do the clouds still. So we'll let this dry. We'll do our the tops of our pillars last, but we got to get these pillars to dry before we put in the mist. All right, now, how do you feel about doing mist and like it's not really mist, it's the top of the cloud. And we're gonna blend it in very soft. I'm gonna take you back to the original painting so you can see what our objective is. We're going to blend this dark right up against the side of this tree and up against the side of these stone pillars so that they create a value contrast in there. And it gives the impression of this mist going from the white where it's got sunlight on it down into the gray of the cloud where it's in shadow. So that's what we're going to do, but we're going to do it with a very soft blending brush. And I'll take a little bit of ultramarine. We'll just kind of mix up some of this neutral stuff we've been working with. And I want to keep it pretty wet and damp. And I'll just come in with this gray. It's basically a gray color. It's all kind of sedimentary, so it should be, able to just sit on the surface and not be, um, staining the paper. And I want to leave the white caps of these stone pillars, the white of the paper. They're going to be white negative shapes. But I'm going to pick up just a little bit of gray, and we'll just kind of drop it into this wet area here. I just wetted it with this brush, and now we're dropping in this nice gray color. Clean our brush, take a tissue and squeeze all the water out of it, and then we're just going to kind of blend this up into the cloud. And we go from a kind of a gray up into a white. And I'm just going to blot away the gray if it gets too high because I want to have a nice white area up in here. And that will really allow us to have um, a nice gradation is what I'm trying to say. Painting and talking at the same time. Clean my brush, get all the water off of it, all the pigment off of it, and then just use the softness of the brush to blend it up into the white of the cloud. I've got to get the green grass out of this brush here so we can get that gradation going. Ah, see how this feels white and then it transitions as in a gradation down into the shadow side of the cloud. And I'm using just a little bit of Payne's gray mixed in with my ultramarine to give it a coolness. And it should granulate a little bit too, so which gives you a nice texture. All right, while that's drying, we've got a couple of things I want to point out to you that we still need to do. So that we'll do kind of a little inventory here of things that still need to be addressed. We're going to come back in and define this edge and shadow that's on the lawn, on the horizontal surface. So I'll darken that a little bit. We're going to put our trim in for the little wrought iron rail at the top of the tower. We're going to put in a few little indications of vegetation on this bush. We're going to finish our shadows here. And then we're going to come back in and put some texture on this on these buildings. We're going to put just an indication of some stonework, very subtle, just a little bit, and it doesn't. A little goes a long ways. All you have to do is suggest a little bit of it subtly, and the viewer will buy off on that 100%. We also have to look at the top of our cloud. Or are we getting enough contrast with the mountain and the white of the cloud? We might need to go back and darken a little bit of our mountains just to, handle that. So this is the stage of a painting where you step back and you kind of assess, how are the values working together? What are the few things that we still need to do? And you kind of put a plan together. Okay, how am I going to address each one of these little things? The one thing I see right off the bat is I lost the white at the top of my little pillar. So the nice thing about sedimentary colors, you dampen it a little bit and you can literally pick up the pigment immediately. I just picked up the white there. I'm going to come back in with the same value as this mist here. I'm going to put the rest of these steps in. They're a little lighter than the shadow side. And you noticed I waited until that dried before I came back and did that. The other thing I want to do is, remember we said we were going to get the back undercutting of these windows. They're just a little bit darker gray. We can even do the same thing with some of these windows, just to create and enhance the sensation of depth in the stonework. Just pulls us into those little holes there. Okay, we've got to get a little bit of shadow on the back side of each one of these pillars. So I'm just going to use my rigger here and just add a little dark there. And we talked about putting some darker green, and I happen to have some already mixed up here that we used for some of our shadows. And I'm just going to come back in and create some dry brush areas around these little stone pillars. Clean my brush and just kind of drag some of that green back away from the edge, and then pick up a little bit of shadow off the base of these pillars and just create a little more dark to anchor them. That works. Okay. Do we really want to do any more with that bush? I always tell people less is more. And I think that we probably don't want to do too much, but I'm going to get some really dark um, dry brush in here. And that's too wet. I've got to dry this brush and get a little bit of darks to go back into um, the shadow holes on this bush. I'm not sure I like that, so we'll just kind of soften some of it, let it be part of the shadows, and then we can always take a little bit of the leave that alone. Okay, there was some orange here that I wanted to put in. Let's work on our stonework next. So if you're ready, I'm going to just wipe up a lot of this really dark stuff that I have in my palette. because it's just going to be too dark. I want this to be really subtle, mainly just kind of a barely there. Um, that's too dark. We'll just take a little bit of the whatever cool color is and mix it with a little bit of warm color, just so we have a ghost of color. And we'll come back in and use the edge of our brush to create a little rectangle, a little some stonework thing, maybe another one here, maybe some over here. Don't do two or three, just do one or two, and then we'll come back with a different color and we'll put in different intensities of stonework. And we're just trying to create texture. And if it's too much, just blot it up. But I think you'll find that if you soften part of these brickworks or stoneworks, they'll just feel like they're blending into the side of the building very nicely, and you don't have to do too much. Just a couple of little suggestions of stonework. And then if you need to switch it up and get a little cooler, drop some cool into one of these stones that you've drawn or that you've put on with a brush, and you will be able to give the impression that light is hitting these from different directions, so forth, but you don't have to do too much. I'm just getting this a little darker as it gets out here towards the edge. As it gets closer to us, it's too much. I don't think we need to do any more of that. Now let's take our rigger. Where did I put my rigger? And I'm going to get that some dark paint, ultramarine and burnt sienna, and make a really nice cool dark using the tip of my rigger. And I'm going to come in and put these verticals in just barely there, not too much. Don't just be less is more. So now we've got a little railing at the top. And now we can come over and we've got right down the middle of these pillars of stone that are like divider posts. We can do almost like a dry brush really fast and a couple of little verticals for the posts. I'm sorry, the rails that come down vertically. And there's a little bit of rail at the bottom. Sometimes it shows up, but it just separates and keeps us from falling into the ravine there. And I think that does a nice job with it. We don't have to do a whole lot more. You can take a little bit of the darker brown and maybe, put a few little planks on the door. That's a main feature of that door. But I think we're probably pretty good there. Don't need to do much more. I'm going to take just a little bit of this warmth and do the side of these caps just to give them some definition. And I think that's probably all we need. Put a little bit of a shadow right underneath there. What do you think? Shall we put a little bit of glaze on this thing? We'll just put something coming down this side just to define that corner. And you notice by using this big brush, it forces us to be pretty loose, but it just defines that stonework as a suggestion. I think I think we're probably at a point where we're done. We might want to take a little bit of warmth and maybe come across here like that. Just a dry brush, just to warm that up to bring it towards the viewer. great place to sign is right there in that little slash of warmth. And we talked a little bit about going back and touching up our mountains. This is where I would use your round brush, your medium-sized round. Make sure it's clean, not got a lot of warmth in it. You're going to want to work strictly with a cobalt color. And I would just make sure you don't have a lot of green in there. So I'm going to add water in here and just wipe up all the green. Rinse my brush, get a fresh deposit of cobalt, water it down so it's just a glaze. There we go. And we can actually come in and create some ravines and textures in the side of this building with just a little bit of a glaze. That's about all I want to do with that, I think. Just soften the bottom of that so it just blends into the clouds a little bit more. And then to give this some animation, we'll throw in some birds. What do you say? We'll take a small brush. You can use your rigger, you can use a really small brush, whatever you want. And I would mix up a little bit of ultramarine and probably mix just a touch of the burnt sienna with it so that it's not a bright circus green. And I would just kind of come in and just put some V's in here, and they're all kind of floating around the top of this building. We want to give it a little bit of gas here with some animation. And over here, maybe we have a little bit of it too. We can always use a little cooler color. There. And what does this do? Obviously, it adds a little motion, but it brings our eye right back to the center of interest, which is our tower. If we wanted to create just a touch of cool on this side of the tower, you can take, a big brush like this and just come right up to the edge and just glaze a little cool on that one side so that it feels like a little bit more sun is on the right side than it is on the left. I still like this little explosion of orange that bled into my wash. Those are kind of fun things. I'm going to take a little bit more clean orange and come right down the side of the. I need to get, you had too much ultramarine on there. We'll get this orange just kind of ties into that roof there. I'm going to darken this edge right up against the building and maybe even bring some of that orange up across the blue. Okay, I think we're probably about there. I'm gonna go back and darken the hole where we look back into this little opening for these windows. And we need to dry down here because if you try to sign a painting where it's wet, your signature is going to bleed and it's not going to look very good. We've all done that. So I'm going to get a nice warm mixture. Get a little bit of dark mixed in with that. All right, here we go. And then I'm going to use a little bit of the orange. See if I can't put a little texture across here. And I think that's a day. What do you think, guys? purposely left this white here to feel like sun shining on that. Sun is shining on the tops of the clouds, tops of this cloud here, and it gets into shadows down behind this fence. Everything on this side of the building is a little darker in silhouette because it's backlit. And if it feels like it needs to be darker, you can always add just a touch of burnt sienna as a glaze, or I'm sorry, ultramarine as a glaze. And you can always just kind of add just a little bit of glaze work and leave a few spots of the whatever the wash was originally, and that enhances the feeling of stonework in there. Definitely very backlit now. So we can always come down along this edge here. I think that works. Now it's very cool, dark. It's got just hints of warmth in it in a few spots. Can actually pick up a little bit of orange if you want. Drop that in there while it's wet. There you go. I think we got a good rendition of the Monte Bianchi. There.
That looks fantastic, Randy. Thank you so much.
I think we got it. The mountains read, the sky reads. The building is our center of interest, and it's a strong shape. It's the dominant shape in the whole painting. And the foreground has a little bit of light that brings us back to the center of interest. The birds kind of help bring us back to our center of interest. The fence points us to the center of interest. All of these things are leading devices that help strengthen the composition. And we've got a strong dark in the foreground that anchors everything and pushes our eye right back up to the tower. So I think we've captured what you would see when you go up here and to the land of the cats.